Good day, ECO736, Development Economics Postgraduate students. Welcome to week 3 and happy Women's Day to all the females in the class. Hope you are enjoying your public holiday today. Well done with your first weekly reading assignment. Your marked assignments have been uploaded into your Dropbox folders on eCanva. Just a quick reminder of this week's agenda, which is basically the same that you'll see in your lesson tool on eCanva. You need to submit your weekly reading assignment 2 this week before the lecture. Those who are doing a presentation, please make sure that you also submit your presentation before this week's lecture. You can check the presentation schedule to see who should be presenting this week. Also review this lecture slide and clips, and then on Thursday we will continue with an eCanva discussion during the lecture period. Session outcomes. After this week, you should be able to discuss government's redistributive role using Bromberger's framework in the South African context. You should also be able to critically assess the trends in poverty and income distribution since the fall of apartheid. Furthermore, you should also be able to discuss factors affecting distributional outcomes in South Africa. A quick reminder of what economic development is. Remember, we regard it as a process, specifically a process of structural change that ensures a sustained rise in living standards of the whole population, i.e., it's looking at economic growth that is inclusive. It doesn't leave anyone behind. Again, with development economics, we focus on structural changes or discontinuities in structure rather than only economic growth. Another important aspect is the distribution of gains from economic growth, and we will start touching on this in more detail for this lecture and the next few weeks. After being exposed to a few readings in development economics and some of the slides, you will start to see recurring critical questions come up, specifically questions relating to poverty and income distribution. Some of these include: who are the poor? What is the extent of relative inequality? And how is this relative inequality linked to the extent of poverty? Who benefits from economic growth? Do the poor benefit from growth? Does rapid growth necessarily cause greater income inequality? Are high levels of inequality always bad? What policies can reduce poverty and also income inequality? These are just some of the critical questions that you've already come across and will be coming across as we dive deeper into issues of poverty and income distribution. Before we take a deep dive into the empirical evidence around poverty and income distribution, it's helpful to take a step back and to use a conceptual framework with which to understand the different types of income and also how governments may try to influence the distribution of this income. For this, we refer to Bromberger's work from 1982. The first step to understanding the conceptual framework linked to Bromberger is to distinguish between primary income and secondary income. Primary income, denoted by YP, can be described as the actual value of income received in cash or in kind by individuals and households. This includes the value of subsistence production activities, for example, people who grow their own fruit and veg to eat. Other examples include salaries, wages, and investment income. Okay, so this distinction between primary and secondary income is very important because it takes us back to structural issues in the economy. Now remember, in our earlier slides when we spoke about development, we said that the focus is on changes in the structure of the economy or discontinuities in that structure. So when we are looking at primary income and how it's distributed between different groups in society, we need to remember that primary income is determined in the total set of markets in that particular economy, i.e., it is a product of how that economy is structured. So if you want to change primary income, you need to change the structural elements within that economy that result in a specific distribution of primary income. Secondary income, on the other hand, can be influenced, or the redistribution of it can be influenced by government, who uses tools such as taxation or government spending, as well as transfer of incomes, which is social spending. Okay? You may think that, wow, this is a serious oversimplification. And if you're thinking that, you are correct. But we use this simplified framework to help us think through very complex scenarios in our economy. So it's an oversimplification that we live with. It helps us to better understand transmission mechanisms, where government tools in distribution can assist secondary income, how it influences primary income if it can, and what the limitations of those tools are. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, government can use tools or policies to affect primary and secondary income to varying degrees. When it comes to influencing secondary incomes, most of the tools are directed at outcomes. So government will use taxes and public spending to change how secondary income is distributed. We can therefore have some governments instituting progressive income taxes or income transfers. For those of you who did public economics, you should be familiar with this. Government may also influence primary incomes mainly through targeting endowments and processes, and the type of policies and tools used are mainly linked to making and enforcing rules, controlling prices, regulation, participation in markets, and asset distribution, of which recently land reform and also minimum wages are often spoken about in the South African press. I won't spend too much time on the next few slides because some of you will be answering this question in your weekly reading assignment, but the processes whereby government can influence primary and secondary distribution are basically contained in the next few slides. So you can read all about this in your Bromberger paper. Finally, Bromberger clearly states that the change or the determination of these distributions of income is extremely complex. So we've mentioned this before already. There does not exist a well-tested or widely endorsed body of theory to model all of these processes. So some of them may be overlapping, and you might question this as you are reading the framework and as you link it to the South African context as well. But what is clear is that government cannot readily control all of these processes, no matter how hard they try. Yes, they can write and implement policies. Yes, they can use tools such as taxation and spending, all of this to change income distributions, but there is a limit to what government can do as well. And we need to acknowledge this, because fundamentally, most of what we see in terms of primary income and its distribution is a function of an economy's structure. So without fundamentally changing the economy's structure, you cannot expect government to wave a miracle, a magic stick and a wand and to fix that. It doesn't work like that. Government's tools are not sharp enough to bring about those changes. It's truly blunt instruments when it comes to changing primary income and its distribution. Something else we need to be very cognizant of is that we must avoid the assumption that if there is a change or if there is no change in these different incomes and its distribution, that it is a function of government policy, i.e. government is responsible. It's very difficult and complex to disentangle any kind of causal relationship because there are so many things that feed into what you see in terms of secondary and primary income. Some of it is more direct than other, like taxation, for example. That's a bit clearer. But as I've said before, there's so many underlying factors in terms of the economy's structure. And it's hard to keep track of all of that at the same time. And most of the time as development economists, we tend to focus on it at a micro level, and we look or specialize in one aspect of it at a time. Myself, for example, I focus on health and human capital, and at a micro level, how those investments in health can potentially influence outcomes. But it is really complex to look at everything holistically and then to assign responsibility to one agent alone or one stakeholder alone, like for example, government over here. Be that as it may, Bromberger does provide a framework that you can use to try and analyze different economies according to the various processes that he mentions. And this is what makes it a useful tool, just to help you add some structure to a very complex analysis. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty, looking at absolute poverty, the extent and the magnitude. If we look at the general progress on extreme poverty, there has been clear progress when looking at the $1.25 a day head count poverty line. Poverty using this poverty line as a cutoff has shown a clear reduction in global poverty. We need to ask ourselves right now, at this present moment, how has COVID impacted the above? Less clear in the literature is progress on the $2 per day head count poverty cutoff. So the incidence of poverty is extremely uneven, and you will see that it is localized in certain countries and certain continents like Africa and Latin America. We will touch on the relationship between poverty and growth, although we do talk about this in greater detail later on in this term. But there does seem to be an association between growth and poverty reduction, where as long as economic growth is inclusive, it will tend to reduce absolute poverty. Lower extreme poverty may also lead to higher economic growth, so that relationship is reinforcing, and so it goes in both directions. And then promoting rapid economic growth as well as reducing poverty are not mutually exclusive or mutually conflicting objectives. So we can, as governments or as different countries, try and aim to achieve both of these objectives, as long as we ensure that the growth is inclusive. Okay, I'm going to stop the first video clip for week 3 over here, since my 15 minutes are almost done. See you in video clip number 2.